Researchers are busy once more. This time, they're making new infections in microbes in their research centers. Researchers normally favor changing effectively existing or terminated microscopic organisms and infections to deliver new strains that will crush our insusceptibility, antibodies, and drugs. Sometimes, they incline toward making new infections in microorganisms without any preparation. Be that as it may, these strains are not generally risky to people despite the fact that they could be dangerous to creatures like mice and even to different microorganisms. Researchers at the University of Alberta have made horsepox, a deadly infection firmly identified with the similarly lethal smallpox. In contrast to smallpox, horsepox doesn't influence people and is simply lethal to ponies. The researchers made the infection during a 6-month study supported by drug organization Tonix. The analysts brought DNA pieces by means of mail request and orchestrated them to shape the infection. The whole task was not costly. The DNA pieces used to make the infection cost just $100,000. The study caused a predicament at the time it was uncovered. Defunct researchers were worried that administrations or even fearmongers could utilize the information to make smallpox infection for organic weapons. A smallpox scourge could turn out to be dangerous for us today. We presently don't get inoculated for it since we annihilated the infection in 1980. The analysts explained that they made the infection since they needed to create improved smallpox immunizations. Tonix later uncovered that it had delivered a smallpox immunization with a horsepox infection. Defunct researchers say that the scientists might have removed horsepox from wild pony populace as opposed to making it without any preparation. Tonix said they would have done precisely that on the off chance that they had realized they had common admittance to the infection. Notwithstanding, that scientist David Evans said they reproduced the infection on the grounds that Tonix would have been unable to market the horsepox infection taken from nature. Somewhere in the range of 1,347 and 1,351, a huge number of Europeans were distressed with a puzzling illness that murdered more than 50 million individuals. Today, we realize this illness is the Black Death, which is brought about by the Yersinia pestis microscopic organisms. Albeit the Black Death is still near, it isn't just about as powerful as it used to be a few years prior. Analysts from a few schools, remembering the University of Tübingen for Germany and McMaster University in Canada, reproduced the lethal microbes from DNA tests separated from the teeth of a casualty who passed on during the plague. They got just 30 milligrams of the microorganisms from the teeth, however that was sufficient to reproduce it as an outcome. Specialists affirmed the first microscopic organism's relationship to the Black Death around today. A few researchers have guaranteed that the microscopic organisms were of various strains, yet they are presently affirmed to be the equivalent. The one we have around today just turned out to be less lethal after it changed. Like their partners at the University of Alberta, researchers at the State University of New York have made a lethal counterfeit infection by purchasing DNA pieces by means of mail request. This time, it is polio, and it is just about as intense as the common one. Mice presented to the fake polio became as similarly as they would have whenever presented characteristic polio in the lab. Fake polio was disputable among researchers. The specialists who created it had taken its code from datasets accessible to nearly anyone. Defunct specialists tried that individuals with ulterior intentions could build up their own fake polio, which is a lot simpler to make than other risky infections like smallpox. Smallpox's hereditary code is 185,000 letters in length, while polio's is only 7,741 letters in length. Despite the fact that we now knew the variant of killing polio, researchers dread that people in any case should be immunized against the sickness since it very well may be reproduced. A couple of years prior, specialists at the Australian National University and the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, CSIRO, created a dangerous transformed strain of Mesopots accidentally. Mesopots is another deadly infection that has a place with a similar family as horsepox and smallpox. The scientists were attempting to create conception prevention for mice at the time that they erroneously made the infection. They invented a quality that advanced the making of interleukin 4, into Mesopots, which they infused into certain mice. The mice were inoculated and shouldn't be hurt by the Mesopots instead of making them mice barren as analysts had expected. The debilitated infection turned deadly and annihilated the insusceptible frameworks of the mice, killing them in 9 days. The new Mesopots was perilous to such an extent that it was impervious to inoculation. A big part of the other inoculated mice presented to the transformed Mesopots likewise died. The specialists were so frightened by their creation that they would not like to distribute their discoveries. They even met with the Australian military to affirm in the event that it was protected to publish. For scientists dread that human smallpox could likewise change and become deadlier whenever it fused with IL-4. In any case, they are uncertain on the grounds that nobody has attempted it yet. We know it won't be long until some researcher does. Serious intense respiratory disorder, SARS, is a deadly infection. In excess of 700 individuals were murdered during a SARS pandemic that ended 8,000 individuals in 29 nations somewhere in the range of 2002 and 2003. Presently, researchers have made it deadlier. The new freak SARS infection was made by a gathering of specialists drove by Dr. Ralph Baric of the University of North Carolina. They call it SARS 2.0. The analysts built up the infection by adding some protein to the normally happening SARS. SARS 2.0 is safe to immunizations and medicines used to fix the normally happening SARS virus. The group said that the examination was essential in light of the fact that the characteristic SARS infection could change and get unsusceptible to our antibodies. By making a deadlier and transformed infection, we could create more grounded antibodies that will save us from a more deadly SARS plague. That is, if the common SARS ever mutates. However, different researchers are concerned in light of the fact that the SARS 2.0 that should save us from a dangerous SARS plague could begin that scourge in the event that it at any point escapes from the lab. Researchers have made a MERS-Rabies mixture infection. The thought is to utilize the infection to build up an immunization that will shield us from both infections. Rabies is a dangerous sickness that can be communicated to people through the nibbles of contaminated canines that typically have the infection in their saliva. Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, is another infection that showed up in Saudi Arabia a couple of years prior. It is firmly identified with SARS and is spread from bats to camels and, at long last, to people. MERS contaminated 1,800 individuals at the hour of its first scourge and killed more than 630. Its casualty rate is around 35%. As we referenced in the past section. SARS tended more than 8,000 individuals during the 2003 pandemic, however murdered a little more than 700. Despite the fact that SARS caused more passings in total terms, it has a lower casualty rate than MERS. Just around 10% of SARS casualties passed on. Also, for the present, we don't have any antibody for MERS. To make the MERS-Rabies mixture, specialists took a few proteins from the MERS infection and added it to rabies. They utilized the new infection to build up another antibody that made mice impervious to rabies and MERS. They accept that the antibody can likewise be utilized for people and camels in danger of getting MERS. X174 is another fake infection we have delivered in research centers. It was made by scientists at the Institute of Biological Energy Alternatives in Rockville, Maryland. The scientists displayed the counterfeit infection after the regular fix infection. Fix is a bacteriophage, a classification of infections that contaminate and eliminate microorganisms. In any case, it has no impact on humans. The analysts make the counterfeit infection in 14 days, yet it takes after the normal infection such a lot of it is difficult to reveal to them separated. The scientists trust that the new infection is the initial phase in creating freak and fake microbes that can be utilized to help man. Specialists from University College London and the National Physical Laboratory have made an anonymous infection that eliminates microorganisms and carries on like a genuine infection. Like X174, it is a bacteriophage yet deadlier. The anonymous infection assaults any microbes around it. In practically no time, it breaks into more modest parts that open and make openings on the collections of the microscopic organisms. The openings immediately become bigger, compelling the microorganisms to release their substance. The microorganisms kick the bucket soon after. Despite its unnerving strength, the anonymous infection isn't perilous to people and didn't assault human cells during tests. In any case, it could enter human cells actually like characteristic infections. Scientists trust the outcomes will be utilized to treat and study bacterial sicknesses in people. The infection could likewise be utilized to adjust the human quality. Some Dutch researchers have made a freak and deadlier adaptation of a generally deadly bird influenza. Characteristic bird influenza isn't effectively communicated among people. Notwithstanding, the specialists modified it so it very well may be. To test their new infection, the analysts presented a few ferrets to it. Ferrets were picked on the grounds that it had comparable bird influenza manifestations to humans 10 ages later. The generally changed infection transformed again and got airborne. Characteristic bird influenza is definitely not an airborne illness. The examination was questionable in the science local area. It turned out to be much more so that our scientists endeavored to distribute the cycle to make the destructive infection. Despite the fact that researchers dread that psychological oppressors could utilize the investigation to create a lethal natural weapon that could murder a large portion of individuals on the planet, the specialists included say that the examination was important to permit a get ready for a transformed bird influenza scourge. In 1918, the world saw the appearance of a lethal influenza plague. This was the H1N1 infection. When it was finished, up to 100 million individuals were dead. Influenza made blood saturate the lungs of casualties. They delivered blood from their noses and mouths prior to suffocating in the blood inside their lungs. The influenza returned in 2009. In any case, it was less deadly despite the fact that it was changed and deadlier than it ought to have been. Researcher Yoshihiro Kuoka took tests of the transformed strain that made the 2009 scourge and utilized it to make a deadlier strain that was impervious to immunizations. This strain was like the one that caused the 1918 epidemic. Kuoka was not intending to create a more deadly form of seasonal influenza at that point. He simply needed to make the first form of seasonal influenza so he could concentrate how it changed and took the option to sidestep our vulnerability. The destructive infection is put away in a lab and could get deadly if at any point delivered.